Hi guys, well look, first of all thanks for coming along, and as you may have heard in my speech, lots of people want to fight culture wars, but the real culture war is, do we back people for being successful? Do we push people up or do we pull them down? And my long held belief is that we have a dark underbelly of tall poppy in our culture where we scapegoat and pull people down too much, and the most important thing we can do is to draw on our long held cultural value. So this is a place people come to these shores for a better tomorrow for themselves and their kids. And you heard that in the guy who said, look, I'm a banker, but my main job is looking after my 4-year-old daughter, and my thought is about her. That, I thought, really for me summed up the speech as exactly the sort of question that I was eager to answer. I think the government, through its deregulatory efforts, can point to a pretty coherent set of reforms that mean his 4-year-old daughter probably will be in a sweet spot to be on the property ladder in her lifetime, even though I think we've failed to do that for several generations to date. So that was the thing I really hoped to be able to say, but also happy to take your questions.
You talked a little bit about what you might be able to do as Deputy Prime Minister, and sort of saying it's a platform to present an alternative vision for New Zealand. Is that the alternative vision that the coalition as a whole is offering, or are you talking more of an ACT-flavoured spin on that?
I think there's an overlap, but it's not a complete overlap. Each party brings its own thing to the table. What I think ACT has always been very strong on is the idea that we're each thinking and valuing beings who have a chance and a choice to make the most of our time on Earth. Now, whether it's the Treaty Principles Bill saying we shouldn't be blaming people for what happened before we were born, whether it's the Regulatory Standards Bill saying if the government's going to restrict our freedom, there has to be a very clear rationale that that's in the public interest, or whether it's charter schools saying, look, not every school works. I was here this morning speaking to a bunch of principals, including the principal of Norwester. That is a school that has been set up with the endorsement of other state school principals because they know that the system doesn't work for every kid. In each case, it's actually a form of tino rangatiratanga, or self-determination, but on an individual basis. And when I talk about whether this is for the government, I think all three parties in the government sign up to that. But I believe that ACT is probably the purest version of it.
The current Deputy Prime Minister has suggested that come May 31 he'll be unbridled and go into campaign mode. Do you think the inverse applies to you, that you become more restrained by the position of Deputy Prime Minister, or not?
To be perfectly honest, I mean, as I said in my initial answer to that question, we both remain one of 20 voices around the cabinet table, as does indeed Chris Luxon. So, I think we need to be cautious of over-egging the change. Our primary responsibility is still to cabinet in our portfolios, whether you're Winston, Chris or me. So I think people would love to over-egg the change. I'm not sure they should. My main priority will still be, as the Minister for Regulation, deregulating the hell out of this place because we're caught up in too much red tape.
You talk quite a bit about the Regulatory Standards Bill and said that's going to be passed this term. Can you be any more specific in terms of the timeline? Has that gone through Cabinet yet? Would you expect it to be introduced to Parliament soon?
Yeah, it's currently before Cabinet. I expect we'll see it introduced to Parliament in the next month or two in order to be passed this year.
And you also talked about the 23,000 submissions, the sort of bow wave of opposition that's kind of been building. Are you concerned at all, or how do you feel about the potential for the Regulatory Standards Bill to become the new Treaty Principles Bill, in the sense of rallying ACT's opponents around in opposition to it?
Well, they can, but they've got to have strong arguments. And so I just asked myself, what is the argument that they're using against this bill? All it does is require that politicians who want to restrict your freedoms are very transparent about why they're doing so, and demonstrating it's in the public interest for them to do so, not in some private interest. Now, if that had been available in the years after the Treaty of Waitangi, especially the defence of property rights, we might have a few less problems as a country. So I think there's something for everyone in the in the RSB.
Is there anything you can do to stop it becoming a lightning rod bill, or do you just have to kind of roll with it and see how the public responds?
Well, when you get 23,000 people making submissions over summer on one of what many people have regarded as one of those boring and technical pieces of legislation. In the past, even my own team don't like me campaigning on it because they don't think it's sexy enough. If you can get people that excited, then you're probably dealing with a level of conspirational thinking that is not going to be pregnable to a rational response.
David, the Finance Minister says Treasury has advised her a smaller operating budget would be sufficient for the Reserve Bank to carry out its function, but that Cabinet opted for a larger number that reflected the comfort of the Reserve Bank Board. Are you comfortable with that?
Well, I believe that we need to seriously reduce expenditure right across government. I'm thrilled to see a 25% restriction. I'm not in a position to discuss cabinet decisions, but what I saw was a cabinet that accepted the recommendations of the Minister of Finance to suggest that she was somehow overruled by cabinet and is now giving more money than she'd otherwise prefer. I don't think that's a fair or accurate reflection. What is critical is that these guys who've had a massive inflation in their funding have done terribly at managing inflation and yet have found time to lecture us on climate change and the treaty, get their wings seriously clipped, and they are, by 25%.
Would you have liked to have seen more money saved?
You look at where they're going to end up, they're not far off where they would have been on their pre-COVID track and their pre-Adrian Orr track. So I think we can point to a pretty good correction on the Reserve Bank budget. Allows them to do the jobs they're required to do, including any additional regulatory functions that have been forced on them in the last 5 years, but no more.
You talked a bit in the speech about a flat tax or a flatter tax that obviously was considered by the Finance Minister, by Treasury last year, didn't get implemented. Is that still a live issue in terms of, I guess, the coalition agreement or in general, or is that sort of being dealt with? Because I think the requirement was to assess it and do it if it didn't make anyone worse off.
Well, it was designed to assess it to test if the National Party's objectives could be achieved more efficiently. That was never going to be a fair test for better tax policy because you'd already priced in a particular direction. In terms of, does New Zealand want to be a country where you get taxed almost 4 times more at 180 grand than you do at 15 grand? The message that sends to New Zealand children is we talk about meritocracy, working hard and getting ahead, but if you actually do it, here's what will happen to you. So as far as I'm concerned, it's always a live issue until we have a more meritocratic tax system. In terms of our current coalition agreement, we've got 2 other parties that want to have 5 tax rates. Yeah.
So it's still something you're pushing for in this term of government, or is it more something that you'll have to put to the electorate again at the next election and hope that you both support and you vote?
Well, we've satisfied the coalition agreement, so we're not relitigating that. But what's clear is that if you want to pay 5 different tax rates, vote for any party but ACT.
Yeah. On coalition provisions or terms more generally, is ACT happy with the level of consultation it received regarding the Prime Minister's trade alliance plan? I've seen some suggestion that it's not just New Zealand First, that ACT that may feel that it should have been kept in the loop a little bit more, briefed better about what the Prime Minister was doing.
Well, we weren't consulted on that. There was no discussion between me and Christopher Luxon. If he believes that he's got it right, then obviously we support him. But it's certainly true that this is a coalition, and any pronouncement made by any of us will always be stronger if it's been discussed previously. However, I can appreciate that sometimes people feel they need to think fast.
Would you have expected, though, to have been consulted normally by the terms of the coalition provisions?
Well, I think that, no, because we don't expect every single thing to be consulted on. However, I think people can judge for themselves if they would like to see a government where people are prepared to discuss the issues of the day and be consultative before taking major initiatives, or where people go out on their own recognizance. Now, recently Winston Peters said that he doesn't feel the need to consult the Prime Minister before sacking Phil Goff. Okay, that's defensible and fair up to a point, but I would say that generally speaking, what New Zealanders want is a government that can work tightly together towards re-election to keep the other guys out. And on that basis, I'm always careful to keep close to people. For example, in the school lunch issue, I called Chris and said, mate, I think we might have some issues coming up in the next month, and we did, but I'd briefed him way ahead of time.
The flip side.
Sorry, can I grab a question?
Sure.
Could you give some examples of how deregulation is making a difference in the Canterbury region?
In terms of issues that are specific, that only apply in Canterbury.
You can expand it out to South Island, if you like.
Okay.
Industries that matter into these economies.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say, the ones I think of actually apply to the whole country. So they apply here, but they don't only apply here. If you want me to think of things that don't apply anywhere else, I might struggle. However, if you look at what we've done to make it easier to get an enduring power of attorney, I think that is hugely helpful to people who find themselves in that position. If you look at what we're doing around health and safety, the whole country enormously helpful. If you look at Canterbury and the amount of growth and development and the potential here, resource management law, hugely helpful. But it's pretty difficult to think of issues that apply in Canterbury that don't to some extent apply elsewhere.
And what about the house deregulation helping the average worker?
Well, I look at something like health and safety regulations. People ultimately want to go to work and be productive and produce more of the good or service they're good at in order that they can take home a bigger paycheck and buy more from other people who are also being more productive. Every time you spend time tied up in health and safety without actually being healthier or safer, you're pulling yourself back from that objective. The same thing with you want to be able to build a home. Making it easier to build granny flats, easier to import foreign materials, easier to get building consents. All of that means that your money goes further, not just for people in the building sector, but for people who are buying their products.
And do you think it's healthy to sort of divide New Zealand into two groups like you did with the in your speech?
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's not about health; it's about honesty and reality. I'll give you one example. People were asked at the start of 2022, would you go into lockdown to avoid an Omicron outbreak? 48% of New Zealanders said they would, 46% said that they wouldn't. That is a pretty even division, and frankly, it was insane. I mean, at that point, we were one of the most vaccinated populations on Earth. We had, been locked down for almost 2 years from the rest of the world, and in some parts of the country for 4 or 5 months cumulatively. We had people in real distress in education, health and business, and yet we had a whole lot of people who were just desperate to get out and get producing again. Then you had a group of people who seriously thought it would be okay to be locked down again, bearing in mind Omicron was more infectious and less virulent, so it was almost impossible to stop and wouldn't make as much difference if we did. So that and many other examples, I believe, show that there are two broad attitudes in New Zealand, and I think it's better to talk about it rather than ignore it. What is unhealthy is to ignore the reality.
Is it as black and white, though, as you portrayed it at points in your speech? I'm thinking you talked about predetermination on the one hand, self-determination on the other, but isn't it a case that there's a little bit of both in most people's lives, that their background and their family sort of shapes the opportunities they have, but they still have an opportunity to forge things on their own terms?
I think the reality is that most people, as you say, have a combination of factors that they can control and factors that they can't. However, I frequently run into people who give almost no acceptance of the factors that are within a person's control. People who genuinely believe that if only the state was to tax a bit more, to redistribute a bit more, then our problems could be solved. I don't believe that's true. I mean, I listen every week in Parliament to the question lines that come out of the Greens, and I imagine the assumptions that underpin it is that rather than there is a combination of the state needs to do better at its social services and we need to give better regard to people's ability to change their own future, all I hear is that the state has failed and that's why we have problems.
Can we just go back to the Trump tariff response briefly? Looking at the other side of it, do you, as a coalition partner, are you comfortable with the way that the foreign minister has behaved? You know, I think you said on the country on Monday this week that the prime minister is the chief diplomat, so they're the ones that ultimately decide these things, whereas the foreign minister is saying, well, call me next time, talking about things being hysterical.
Yeah.
Short-sighted, is that ministerial behaviour?
All I know is the people out there want us to work together for the common good, and I seek to do that as much as possible. If people are going to ask me, then yes, I think it's generally better to consult and talk early and talk often, rather than go off and take your own initiative. I think that actually is less helpful. But I also accept that there are no hard and fast rules. Sometimes.
There have been reports, or a report this week, that the New Zealand First Board is preparing for an early election this side of Christmas, and the suggestion seems to be that your turn in the Deputy Prime Minister's chair may precipitate that. Does that concern you at all? Is it a sort of lack of confidence, I suppose, that their party seems to think that everything's going to fall apart and you're going to need to go to the polls?
What concerns me is that a serious journalist of great pedigree such as yourself is giving credence to Richard Harman's latest reports.
Okay, you don't believe there's any truth to that?
No, I mean, look, I greatly admire Richard Harman's journalism through the 80s and 90s. I think sometimes he really does interview his typewriter.
And sorry, just going back to your majority from Mediocracy, do you think they are the majority, and what would you say to them to convince them to come along?
Look at our pioneering spirit. Look at our history as a country. Look at the way that people come to these lands for a better tomorrow. Do we really believe that the way that we pull people down, the way that we see success as being somehow sinister, the way we scapegoat groups of people, whether it's landlords, whether it's licensed firearm owners, whether it's small businesses, whether it's farmers, whether it's supermarket owners, we've got to stop pulling people down for their success and assuming that somehow, somewhere, they've pulled a Swiftie on us. Actually, for the most part, it's just people trying to make the best of their life.
Are they the majority, that group?
I think if you look at some of the polling out there and New Zealanders' attitudes, the polling I gave you, for example, they are a slight, well, they're certainly a plurality, and maybe a slight majority of those who identify one way or another.
Do you think you get an unfair rap sometimes? There's been a lot of coverage about ACT being the troublemaker in the coalition, and you look at what New Zealand First has done in the last couple of weeks, and then you're giving a speech like this with, big ideas. Is it fair the way that you're being portrayed? Do you take issue with any of it?
Well, facts are friendly. So if you look at what I do, I've got a series of policies that I believe are for the best interest of New Zealand, and I seek to implement them. You look at Brooke van Velden and Workplace Relations and Safety and DIA, you've got Simon Court, you look at Nicole McKee and Karen Shore, you look at Andrew Hoggard out in the rural space, ex-ministers, head down, bum up, and I think bringing the kind of change the party promised. If you look at what other people have got up to, that's not for me to judge, it's for others.
Just sorry, jumping back again, the Regulatory Standards Bill, different from the Treaty Principles Bill in that full support is in the coalition agreement. National and New Zealand First have to support that through to their final reading. Are you confident they're still in support of that? There's been no indications?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, it's a deal's a deal. Sure, we've worked really hard to go through the proper process so that people can say, well, if you're in favour of lawmaking, then you have to make this law with proper consultation and so on. That's taken longer than I would have liked, but we're nearly there. Yeah. All right, folks. Well, look, I really appreciate you coming along, and hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.